So it's time to set up L&D. You might be the person who's been hired to do it. You might have moved internally into the role. You might be the owner or the leader of the business and thinking that this is the solution to the challenges you're facing right now, or a good way to prepare for the future. Whoever you are, you're in charge of making it happen, and I want to help. I believe everyone deserves the opportunity to grow, no matter where they work, and that the organisation benefits as well. I've had the privilege of setting up the L&D function from scratch at a tech startup turned ASX-listed company, and I'm in the process of doing it again right now. Welcome back to Starting Up L&D for the new year. Things got a little hectic in the closing months of 2024, but I am back and I am excited to keep learning how we can get the L&D function up and running when you're an amazing team of one. This episode started as trying to work out what to focus on for the new year, when you've got onboarding, performance, and leadership as things that you need to take care of. It's hard to know what's the most important. I started looking into research on onboarding, leadership, the different impacts that they have on performance and engagement. Now, shocker, as expected, onboarding tends to be more important for helping new hires adapt and get up to speed for performance faster, while leadership is more about that sustained performance and long-term engagement. That's why both of them are on our list of things to update internally this year, starting with onboarding, because when it's not quite right, it can take a lot of extra time and energy from a lot of people. And new starters' tolerance for anything less than a great onboarding experience continues to go down with every piece of research that's out there. Talking about research, I got super nerdy for this one. I went back to my psychology literature review roots and started digging for some evidence-based advice on how to do onboarding right in 2025. And I found a bunch of stuff. So, getting started, what is onboarding? And how is it different to induction? When I started this journey, I thought that it was mostly just semantics, but the way that people talk about the two things, I think I might have been wrong. Onboarding is the bigger picture, the big process of getting the employee into the organisation. It's holistic, it starts before the person joins the business and goes until they're a fully fledged member of the organisation. Onboarding includes all of the admin, the setup work, the information sharing, the organising of who needs to be where and when, training, feedback, goal setting, basically everything that a new person needs to settle in, be amazing, stick around until they stop being the newbie. Some say that it starts when recruitment leads off. Others say that recruitment is part of the process too, which I think is fair and maybe not something that we instinctively consider from an L&D perspective because we're not traditionally in charge or really heavily involved in that part. For the record, I am definitely team onboarding starts at the interview. One of my past jobs was actually doing all of the recruitment and the onboarding paperwork part of the process. So I have lived that part firsthand and I know how hectic it can get. I've also helped HR leaders design, build, and automate their onboarding admin parts about 30 to 40 times. So I have seen quite a few over the years. But this podcast is not about stuff that I already know. There are a heap of models out there to get started, formalizing how we think about this big fuzzy thing called onboarding. Then Manan and Shine talk about it in terms of how to describe the things that happen. So, for example, is it more formal with official training and sessions, or is it more informal where everything kind of happens on the job? They've got 6 different dimensions to talk about onboarding. You can have collective versus individual. So, is it a solo experience or are they part of a cohort? Will it be formal or will it be informal? Is that more official classroom-based stuff, or is it just that we're kind of learning on the job? Sequential versus random. I found this one really interesting because I've been part of both kinds. It's pretty much just whether there is actually a preordained set of steps in there or it just kind of takes it as it happens. Fixed versus variable. So are we talking about a time-based progression through this process, or are we using something else as a gate? So for example, testing someone's competency rather than the number of days that they've been in a job. Serial versus disjunctive. This is one of my favorite ones. So are we weaving in experienced people as part of the onboarding process, or do we keep them off in a separate room, totally all by themselves until they're ready to join society? And lastly, investiture versus divestiture, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, What it means is, are we trying to embrace the different parts of you, or are we forcing you to leave those unique parts of you behind so that you conform and fit into the mold? As part of my holiday entertainment, I've been watching The Rookie, really great show. Basically, there's a 40-year-old newbie cop in Los Angeles, played by Nathan Fillion. And so while I was looking at that and doing this research, I started trying to categorize his on-the-job training based on the dimensions. What I got was that it's collective. He's got two other rookies in his group. One of them he was dating for a while. So, from a HR point of view, I'd probably recommend avoiding that. Overall, it seemed very sequential and quite fixed. There were clear timeframes for exams. I did find it hard to categorize whether this newbie cop experience was formal or informal. This is set after all of the academy part where they're in the classrooms, and he's really out there, in the streets of LA on the day-to-day basis. One day he's chasing a dude that stole a forklift. Next day he's busting a drug dealer. Serial because they pair all of the rookie cops up with a really experienced training officer. It's perfect for this kind of job because if you think about being a police officer, particularly in somewhere like Los Angeles, it's super varied. You really need to have those adaptive behaviors. They need to be showing initiative. They need to be having good judgment. Those aren't things that you can learn just from a book or a workshop. It's why mentoring has always been a thing and probably will continue to be a thing for a long time into the future. And that investiture versus divestiture is cool. It might be because this is a TV show and therefore a drama, and the weird outlier has to be the hero. But it seemed while I was watching the show that while they're trying to make him conform, it's the things that made him different, like having some life experience as part of being a parent of an adult child, that ended up saving the day when he could talk somebody down. So I really liked reading about these ways of describing onboarding because it feels like seeing those individual customization options as discrete things that we can kind of dial up, dial down, tweak to make it perfect, instead of just what we tend to do, which is look at the overall vibe. If you've got like a small team or a specialized job that takes a long time to learn, you can afford to have a more informal approach. Pair them up with an experienced person and they learn as they go. Whereas if you're trying to onboard a whole heap of retail staff just before Christmas, you're probably going to want to do it in bulk. It's going to be an intensive block and you really do want them to kind of all come out exactly the same. So, cool concept for how to organize things. But it doesn't really talk about what you should be including or the things that we should be aiming for. Dr. Taylor Bauer has been studying onboarding for a bit over 25 years. So, she really knows what she's talking about. It's all about the 6 C's. So it's a really easy model to remember. And I love the way that you can look at this both as things that you should be including in the process when you're building it and implementing it, but they're also outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So the 6 C's in order, they stack from the one that you need to deal with first right the way up to the top. So we've got compliance, clarification, confidence, connection, culture, and check back, which I think might be a bit of a stretch to make it into a C because feedback probably makes just as much sense. But look, the model started out as 4 C's in 2015. She's made it to 6. I respect that she's keeping the pattern going. So that base level, the foundations of how everything should be working is compliance. What you're doing here is really making sure that your new hires understand the legal, the policy-related rules and regulations, and that you're also following all the things that you have to do as part of the law. It's housekeeping. It's boring. It's necessary. Doing just this on day one of your job is the worst. You finish up for the day signing pieces of paper and reviewing policies. You get home and someone asks, "What's your new job like?" And you can't actually answer the question because you haven't met anyone or done anything yet. So to make this good in an onboarding experience, the recommendations are automating, eliminating it if you can, or at least get it done early, and really try to do as little as possible of it on day one. Next, we talk about clarification. So this is really about 2 things. First of all, helping them to understand their roles and the performance expectations, but it's also about knowing what's going to happen in their onboarding experience. So giving people clarity on what the first day, the first week, the first month is going to look like. If you can set and communicate those clear plans for them,
it's going to make everyone a lot more comfortable. Talking about getting comfortable, this is when we get into confidence. So we're really wanting to build up that sense of assurance in their abilities to be able to do their job. You know that feeling when you've been a new person before and you get to that point where you feel like you might know what you're doing. Setting and achieving goals, even if they're small ones, is something that's really helpful along the way here. So as part of great onboarding, the recommendations here are setting and working towards goals and also recognizing progress. Let's keep on rolling through and talk about connection. So connection is about facilitating those relationships with, their colleagues, their manager, and other important people that they need to know in the business. We really want somebody when they're joining the organization to feel like they're being welcomed and that they're valued. And connecting with their team is a really great way to build that connection with the business. Making sure that you have those personal connections with key people, and also making sure that we can raise awareness that there is a new starter across the business so that others can keep an eye out for them and make them feel welcome. Culture, it is all about those organizational norms and values and our goals. It starts at the recruitment process and it really gets shaped during the onboarding process. So this one's a really good reminder for us when we are designing and delivering onboarding experiences to make sure that what we're doing really reflects our values. We're talking about our strategy and our ways of working so that we can share them with this person and help them to get comfortable. And last but not least, check back. So following up, making sure that we're giving them feedback, but also that we're getting the opportunity for them to tell us how they're going, because it is an ongoing process. We really want to make sure that we continue to improve it. And a key part of that is making sure that we know what's going on. If we then talk about the differences between all of that and induction, induction is seen more as part of onboarding. So it's less about compliance and clarity and confidence and more about that connection and culture kind of thing. So we're really trying to familiarize people with their environment and the people that are in it. And everyone assumes that it's HR that delivers it. No comment. Let's talk a little bit about why it's important. What are we trying to achieve here? How do we measure if we're doing it right? I know that we instinctively know that onboarding is important, but I really wanted to come to the table with more than just, well, everyone knows that it's important. This is where I got super nerdy. I found this meta-analysis that was released last year in the Psychological Bulletin, and it looked at 83 different field experiments over decades. And they found that the odds of retention across all of these were 1.46 times higher for those in an onboarding or a socialization program compared to the control groups that were not. Pretty cool. Overall, the well-designed onboarding programs also have been found to increase engagement with the role, the organization, and with job satisfaction. So we know it's important. Let's now get a little bit more into those details and talk about who we're onboarding and into what. I started here by having a look at some of the key changes that are happening now in the workplace, stuff that we need to consider. Like I said, I've been around in the onboarding space for a while. I didn't want to get complacent, and I really wanted to keep my eyes focused more on recent investigations. But there was a lot talking about the impact of hybrid work. One article from 2023 was looking at some of the factors that enhance newcomer adjustment in hybrid work contexts. By the way, I've got a list of all the articles as well, so if you want to have a read of them, I'll make sure that that's accessible. But this article focused on technostress and social isolation. Technostress, super fun word, was coined exactly when you think it was, back in the 80s, when we were talking about the human cost of the computer revolution. Whatfix's got a really good blog article on Technostress, and their whole thing is about helping people learn new tech. They talked about different kinds of technostress. So we've got techno overload, too many Slack notifications, techno invasion, where it comes through your boundaries, techno complexity, techno uncertainty. That one is that there was a digital transformation, but you didn't get the email about it. And techno insecurity, which is being worried that robots are going to come and take your job. So it's caused by a lot of things, but the main culprits there are information overload, constant connectivity, rapidly changing technology, dodgy design or setup of the technology, and just some good old-fashioned fear of tech. So for remote teams, this sort of thing decreases satisfaction, productivity, it increases burnout and turnover. Even worse, this level of technological overload can actually kill off things like initiative and memory and concentration. Yeah, so that one was supported by a study of about 9,000 Swedes over the course of 2 years. These guys looked at a bunch of things that happen at work that are unpleasant, including things like conflicts, quantitatively having too much work, but of all of them, information and communication technology demands, so things like too many emails, constant interruptions, technical issues, this had the strongest link with cognitive complaints, so issues with concentration, with memory, with decision making, and not being able to think clearly. And the worst thing was that it was linked not just with those issues being more prevalent at the time, but because it was a longitudinal study, a year later, it was still the most predictive of those issues in those people. And to make it all worse, this was all back in 2013, which just so happened to be the year that Slack was launched. Things have changed since then. So let's talk about the application of this. How are we going to manage the amount of technostress that we're exposing our new people to? How can we intentionally reduce the uncertainty, overload, and complexity that they're dealing with? How can we make sure that they have clear boundaries for when to be offline so that that invasion is not a problem? Right, still on that hybrid work study, the other factor that they looked at was social isolation. However you might feel about it, the facts are that before 2020, a lot more of us spent the whole week in the office with each other. Then we spent some time not doing that at all. Then we did it a bit. And now, depending on your organization, it might be a bit more, it might be a lot. If you're not in the office, it's a lot harder to have those serendipitous moments where you bump into someone in the kitchen or lean over and ask the person next to you a quick question. Some of the things that have been shown to help in those remote or hybrid onboarding contexts are things like role clarity, really working to build those solid trust-based relationships, and the perception of organization and supervisor support. Interestingly, those perceptions of support are the exact same thing that are useful for enhancing in-person adjustment to a new role. Bringing this back to our 6Cs, it's a really good reminder that this is not just about the compliance stuff. How do we build this onboarding process to help people be really clear on what's going to happen during onboarding and what they need to do in their role? How do we help to get new people connecting with each other in the organization, even if they never meet face to face, especially if they're not in the same time zone? We've talked about what we're onboarding people into. Let's keep going and now talk about who we're onboarding, because we're not all the same. I wanted to get really specific here because there's lots of kinds of jobs out there to onboard people into. There are a couple of specific groups that I've got my eye on. Number one, onboarding salespeople. There was an experiment that was looking at onboarding salespeople and comparing different socialization approaches, which means onboarding programs. And they compared a centralized onboarding program, so one that's delivered by head office, everyone gets exactly the same information, versus a decentralized one, which was more personalized when the direct manager was more involved in delivering that information. The decentralized group had 23% higher performance. Well, if you think about the role of a salesperson, you're trying to solve slightly different problems every time and adapt on the fly. If you get started during onboarding to build that habit of taking a more innovative and a more adaptive approach, it makes sense that it'll be helpful in that kind of job. Side note, the benefit of this was even stronger when the manager of that new person had a smaller span of control. Now that's great in a research situation. How do we, in application, balance the consistency and efficiency, we have to say it, of a centralized, let's always do it the same way process, with the effectiveness and the innovation encouraging of a more personalized onboarding when the manager is more directly involved? Because we are going to get pressure to do it in that centralized way. And personalized is much harder to set up and maintain. Let's talk about software engineers as well. Big part of the group that I support. There was a 2022 study on how onboarding affects engagement and retention in the IT sector. They found that longer programs, so we're talking like a 9-month program, increased retention after 12 months. And this was based on about 350 engineers over the course of 3 years, so 3 cohorts. That extended onboarding program had junior software engineers go through an intensive 2-week boot camp. Then they had ongoing technical and soft skills training, also known as people skills. They had a mentor and a life coach, whatever that means. All up, it was about 50 hours extra over the course of the 9 months. And this is compared to some of the engineers that were brought into the business that just had the 2-week introduction. A different study compared new developers, ones that were mentored for 3 days at the start by an experienced developer versus ones that were not. The mentees were more active than those who didn't get mentoring for the first 16 weeks in terms of the work that they were producing. It's pretty amazing. Now, depending on the size of the business, software engineers can actually have regular mini onboarding experiences. Depending on the way that your business is set up, your engineers might move teams based on project needs. Most of the developers that I know change teams and managers about every 18 months or so. So they get really good at onboarding. Interestingly, in terms of productivity with those changes, there is evidence to show that stronger social ties when joining a new project were associated with lower productivity at the start, but higher productivity later on. So it's kind of an investment. Reading through all these things, I first thought, well, of course the ones that got more personalized attention and ongoing support stuck around and did better than the ones that were given just the basic training and sent off into the world. I'm not sure that the 9 months had anything to do with it. But then when I was reading that the whole extra program was only 50 hours over the course of 9 months and that it still had a significant effect on retention, I thought, cost versus benefit, this might be worthwhile. And I love that this study looked at ongoing learning in terms of people skills as well. Thinking about what are some of the most important non-technical skills in your organization that we can actually work and build into the onboarding plan. And then the last thing here is just managing those expectations of leaders of engineers on that socialization front. The fact that we can communicate to say there is evidence that time spent building those social connections now will end up paying off later. We're going slow now so that we can go fast in the end. Last group of people now, delivery consultants. Now, this is one of those jobs where the title can vary across the organization and the industry that you're doing it in. Some other names that you might hear would be implementation manager, occasionally customer success manager gets used for this one as well. The people who work with the customer to get the new thing, usually a piece of software, set up, configured, and doing what they need it to do. These are roles that are customer facing. They involve pretty varied situations. They need adaptive behaviors, just like the salespeople need and benefit from having that encouragement to be adaptive during their onboarding process. They need technical expertise and strategic thinking to deliver project outcomes, often in a high-stakes setting, like the software engineers that we looked at. So in these types of roles, there's often quite a wide range of competencies that need to be developed. There's a mix of skills that have to get sharpened, knowledge that needs to be possessed, behaviors that we need to see where the rubber actually hits the road. These people might have been chosen for some of the skills as part of the recruitment process, but it's pretty rare that they have the company-specific knowledge that they need to be competent right away. And you need to see those behaviors in action as early as you can. With all of that in mind, nothing specific came up, weirdly enough. So the next thing that I did was look for technically complex consultative roles, which I think anyone who's done one of those jobs would probably consider pretty apt. And here's what I found. Number 1, knowledge sharing can help with building competencies. So you can improve a new starter's ability to build their competencies and their confidence through knowledge sharing. Specifically, making knowledge sharing channels available and building a culture or an environment that generally supports knowledge management as a thing that matters. This is based on a Canadian study that was published last year. They looked at about 3,500 public servants through the lens of that younger hybrid workforce that prefers to learn autonomously. They looked at the availability of knowledge sharing channels. They grouped them into things like traditional, digital, and social media tools for knowledge sharing. Traditional was stuff like team meetings, feedback, informal exchanges, and classroom training. Digital included an intranet or document repositories, online training. Enterprise social media, which is a fun name, was all about messaging, forums, wikis, and emails. Side note on this study, only 74% of the people surveyed said that they had email as a knowledge sharing channel, which was really interesting. So if you're in the Canadian Public Service and you don't have email, send me a pigeon or something. I'd love to learn about your experience. That's me getting off track and being really interested in the methodology of the research again. All right, so coming back to these channels though, just having them available significantly increased the new hire's perception of their own competence after 6 months. It was an impact of about 11%. It worked better if they were happy with the channels, but even just having them was a really good start. The cool part of this was that the culture had an even bigger impact on the perceived competence than the channels. So what this means is that, yeah, it's important to have the tools, but more than having the best tools that there are around there, it's about how well people are using them, which can either be really terrifying or it can be really freeing because it's a lot easier just to get started. All right, critical brain hat comes on now. And I go, yes, I know that this study only looked at the self-perception of competence, not actual competence. But like all of those books about magic boarding schools, we know that the first step is always believing in yourself. So without putting our new people into a state of technostress, how can we make sure that they have access to knowledge sharing channels? Also, how can we make knowledge sharing more a part of the culture in general? Maybe we can get people excited about it under the banner of helping out the new kids. Training. Yes, there is always going to be training, but it has to be for specific work tasks or you risk overwhelming people. This one is from a Norwegian study of public servants in IT. I know a lot of public servant research out there. So their findings suggest that an overload of general knowledge about the organisation can be overwhelming and not helpful, but that it might be more effective to give new starters training on specific work tasks relevant to their individual roles early on. Now, it was only 20 people that they interviewed. This probably needs some more support to completely overhaul your process. But it does make sense. Our instinct from a batch-based perspective is sort out all the paperwork, launch straight into the here's who we are as an organisation and why it's awesome to work here, and then get them started doing their jobs. But the idea that we should use some of that first week to teach them something practical and personalised is worth thinking about. Comes back to those 6 C's again: clarity and confidence, then culture, right? Imagine if the poor rookie Nathan Fillion had to sit through a session on every possible crime that he might encounter before he hit the streets of LA. It'd be overwhelming for him, and it would be boring for us. It's much better to have him train on the basics and have an experienced person beside him to help him learn in that moment. The question for us then is, how can we triage the things that a new starter needs to know? Maybe we could apply a risk management lens. Let's think about what are the high probability, high impact scenarios that they need to know how to deal with early on. Realistically, I know it might hurt to say, but our values and how to apply for leave might not be at the very top of that list, and that's okay. So to wrap things up when it comes to overall best practice for onboarding programs, let's come right back to that meta-analysis from 2024. Firstly, onboarding tended to be more effective when they included identifying effective task behaviours, which totally tracks with that Norwegian public servant study about giving the practical training first before you're talking about a company culture brain dump. Also, they found better results when they were encouraging proactive behaviours, like with the salespeople study, and facilitating that social integration. I did wander off a little bit here and started looking at proactive behaviours in more detail. Found this amazing New Zealand study that was looking at the effectiveness of proactive behaviours by newcomers in predicting things like the person's learning, their well-being, and their engagement. The proactive behaviours that they were looking at were things like seeking feedback, networking, general socialising, trying to build relationships with your direct manager. General socialising and building relationships with your leader were the strongest predictors of learning. I mean, look, we're only talking about 5%, but the fact that those two behaviours can account for even that amount of variance in someone's learning experience on a consistent basis is a good reason to pay attention and say that socialising is important. One of the things that made this extra interesting for me was the fact that their participants were 172 professional temps, so people that were used to taking on those 12-month placements. In the study, they were actually calling them expert onboarders. What does this mean? Well, it means that the most effective onboarding programs encourage new starters to self-initiate those future-focused behaviours that will help them to succeed. They help them to learn how to do the key tasks of their role early on, and they help them to get to know the community of people that they're working with. I don't know about you, but that sounds a bit like autonomy, mastery, and purpose to me. Big shout out to Dan Pink. One thing that might help with this is getting the new hire to help other people as part of their onboarding program. Like I said, I'll give a proper citation of all the articles, but I just want to have the title of one of them because it was too cute not to say in full. Helping others makes me fit better. The effects of helping behaviour by newcomers and co-worker attributed motives on newcomers' adjustment. Adorable, right? These people found that demonstrating helping behaviours as a newcomer helps to improve their organisational commitment by increasing their task mastery and their social connection. In other words, when a new hire is helping other people, they get better at their job and they build connections with their co-workers faster. So it's a smart idea to include opportunities to help others in meaningful ways as part of the onboarding process. How on earth do we do that? In a past role, the engineering team always had onboarding projects where the new person would work on a thing that needed doing in the software or a problem that needed solving. It was easy enough, but nobody had ever had the time to deal with it. So the new person would solve the problem, build the thing, and then share it with the business. And it was honestly often to some sheer delight, not just from their team of developers, but other parts of the business too, like the customer support team or the salespeople. I was really inspired, so I got a bit cheeky and started farming out some of my own onboarding projects. One person ended up becoming the king of the competitor playbook that everyone was using. And more recently, the new office manager has been making friends and getting to know people around the world by updating the office manuals that I was going to have to update myself for our induction program. All right, back to that meta study one more time and just some of the other things that make onboarding effective. These last two were not surprising, but if we're being brutally honest, a little bit hard to hear. In-person delivery and programs that are staggered over time are more effective than a once-off or a pre-recorded video. So as much as we've all got other stuff to do, there is scientific evidence that I cannot optimize humanity. With that in mind, how can we give people that personal experience when we are admittedly time poor and we're not always in the same time zone? This isn't just learning and development or even HR's thing to do. So how can we leverage the wider business for those personal connections, the formal ones and the general socializing? And how do we make sure that we're building a program and not a presentation? Well, prioritizing information definitely helps here. We can't do the whole thing all at once, but we can plan out how it can go over the course of a few months and work from our top priorities all the way down. Plus, we can leverage a bit of tech for some reminders to nudge those conversations. It loops back in with that engineering study that longer onboarding programs can be more effective, and that sales study that the personalized onboarding helps to encourage the right behaviors. When I got to this point, my brain was full. So I went back and I made an onboarding design bingo card. Based on all the research, based on all the best practice stuff that's out there, here are my priorities that are in my plan for the next onboarding program that I build. Number one, at the design stage, getting the big picture right. It's going to be a longer process and it'll be more clearly defined for everyone. #clarity. So committing to 12 months worth of staggered steps, making sure that everyone knows what happens when, and weaving in that ongoing technical and people skill development and some milestones without making it too heavy. Those 50 hours, that's plenty. Also being really intentional about the vibe that we're going for. With the size that we are, I've got to accept that this is going to be more informal and on the job. But I think it's important that we have some things like sequential steps, that we have cohorts for people to be part of, and incorporating those experienced people as part of onboarding, because I straight up can't do it all. And lastly, in the design process as well, thinking about what we're showing them of our culture from day one as we get to know each other. Next is about some of the elements to include when we build it. So really making sure to include elements that help with confidence without overwhelming people. What I'm talking about here is making sure that I promote the proactive behaviours that help with their learning and their well-being and their engagement, as well as their social integration. Getting their leader to work with them on selecting an onboarding mini project would be a great way to help them help others and also feel good. Also really important to include those practical task-based training opportunities early. Let's get clear and prioritize what are the most useful competencies that people need in their roles, and then work down the list over time, making sure that we've got some progress markers in there that they can celebrate. I realize that I can actually do this for company information as well, and that I don't have to cover everything on day one, especially if they've got access to some knowledge sharing channels for any of those unexpected out of sync questions. And as well, making sure that these people have got time early with an experienced mentor for some more personalized learning in those complex technical roles. Continuing on, the other thing to prioritize and plan for is those connection opportunities. And I'm talking both synchronous and the non-face-to-face stuff. So number one on that list is making sure that their direct manager knows how important the relationships that they have with this person is in this new person's experience. I need to educate them, make sure that they understand why and what to do, and that it's not just HR's job. To equip them, make the information that they need easy to access, make the process straightforward. I can automate a bunch of reminders to make it plentiful there as well. And then lastly, embedding it. So following up, making sure that they are meeting those expectations and that they do have the support that they need. From the new hires point of view, definitely encouraging those proactive social behaviors, that general socializing. We've got social Slack channels. There's a channel for dogs, there's a channel for cats, there's a channel for memes. We got Donut. If you've never heard of that, it's kind of like a safe for work version of chat roulette where they pair you up with somebody else in the business each week and you have a 15-minute chat. Welcome messages is something that we already do really well, but I think there's an opportunity to expand that out and make people more aware of who's joining their local office. And also Bonusly. I know there's a heap of different peer recognition tools out there. This happens to be the one that we use. And it's a great tool for helping to build that connection, both in giving recognition and also, encouraging people to give that to the new starter as well. And this one's a big thing for me, accepting that face-to-face contact is important. Yes, we can combine some asynchronous learning, some pre-recorded stuff with live follow-ups. So for example, still have an induction video to watch on their own time, but have a debrief session for some questions. So what we're really trying to do here is let the video do the bits that it's best at, which is sharing repetitive info on demand so that people like me and others involved in this onboarding process can do the people-y bits, those shorter, more personal conversations that can cover some of the edge cases and start building that connection. Compliance, we got to talk about it. The goal here is just to sort it out early, smoothly, and using tech to automate this as much as possible. The less housekeeping that people have to do on their first day, the more space there is for other stuff like connecting. We can also use tech to communicate with the other people that are involved. So, managers, IT, payroll, HR, local office space, so that everyone's informed and reminded exactly what they need to do, when they need to do it, and I don't have to follow them up. And as part of the tech thing as well is using it to gather feedback as part of the core element of this process. This is both for them to get feedback on how they're going, and it's also for us to understand their process. This is Checkback, Dr. Bauer's 6th C for those playing at home. And lastly, a bonus thing to remember amongst all of this is to make sure that they're not overwhelmed by Technostress. We need to protect them from overload by drip feeding them the relevant stuff, offering clear instructions on how to use the tools, and to help their manager to work with them to set clear boundaries from day one. All of that's what's been rolling around in my brain for the past month. I'm really excited to build this out and tick off all of those things on my great onboarding bingo card. Talking about checking back, I'll come back to this once it's up and running and share what I've learned. I would love to hear your thoughts though. Hit me up on LinkedIn, and definitely if you've got some feedback or you'd like to recommend the show, whatever channel you're listening in on, it'd be really helpful for me. Thanks for joining us on Starting Up L&D. See you next time.